What would you do if the man you trusted with your whole heart handed his company to the wrong person in one quiet morning, and before the sun had even set, the life you were building together had been shattered by betrayal, blood, and the sound of a hospital monitor keeping hope alive by a thread? That day did not begin with fear. It began with sunlight, trust, and the dangerous comfort of believing that the worst had already passed. CEO Jack sat in his office convinced he had made a wise decision for the future. Tu Tien was at home, tending her garden with the quiet devotion of a woman who had learned to build peace from simple things. But while one heart was making room for relief and the other was nurturing fragile hope, a darker hand was already moving against them. Behind a respectful gaze, greed had begun to sharpen itself into action. A promotion would become a trap, a road would become a crime scene, a garden would become ruins, and before night could fall, Tu Tien would be forced to choose not between comfort and sacrifice, but between collapsing under terror or becoming strong enough to chase the ambulance carrying the man she loved. The morning entered Jack's office like a promise. Golden light slipped through the tall glass windows and stretched across the polished floor, the large desk, the quiet order of files, and the face of a man who, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself a small breath of relief. The company still carried burdens, deadlines, and risks, but in that moment, none of them seemed impossible. Jack sat upright in his chair with the controlled calm of someone used to carrying more than he ever said aloud. Across from him stood Fook, attentive, respectful, modest in posture, every detail of his manner arranged to invite trust. Jack looked at him with open confidence. He had watched Fuchs work. He had measured his steadiness. He had seen what he believed was loyalty. And after so much exhaustion, the chance to place part of the weight into someone else's hands felt almost like grace. So he told him directly, with a voice that held both authority and warmth, that from this day forward he would be promoted to the position of special assistant. More than that, he would be entrusted with broad authority to act in Jack's place for the coming period. It was not a minor courtesy. It was the kind of trust that only a tired man gives when he has finally convinced himself he has found someone solid enough to help him hold the walls up. Jack even smiled. It was not the polished smile he wore for investors or employees. It was softer than that, almost fraternal. He rose, placed a hand on Fuchs' shoulder, and spoke to him not only as an executive, but as a man grateful to feel less alone. For one suspended moment, the room was filled with trust so complete that it seemed almost sacred. Sunlight flashed across the glass tabletop. The future, from where Jack sat, looked just a little steadier than it had the day before. And that was precisely what made the betrayal so cruel. Because Fuck received every word with the exact expression Jack needed to see: respect, gratitude, humility. But behind that lowered gaze, behind the obedient posture, something colder had already taken root. He had not stepped into the office that morning as a grateful subordinate. He had stepped into it as a man who had been waiting for access, waiting for authority, waiting for one last piece of trust to be placed in his hands so he could turn it into a weapon. The office door closed quietly behind him. Later, in a private room far from the easy warmth of Jack's optimism, Fuck sat alone before the hard light of a computer screen. The room itself was ordinary cold air, a table, a chair, the low electronic hum of machinery, but what unfolded inside it was not ordinary at all. His fingers moved over the keyboard with the smooth certainty of someone not improvising, but executing. Step by step, line by line, he shaped the outline of a plan that had already been living in his mind long before Jack's promotion made it easier to carry out. The scheme was precise. He would move against the company, pull apart its internal stability, push it toward bankruptcy from the inside, And while the business fell, he would make sure Tu Tien was drawn into the chaos so completely that neither she nor Jack could find stable ground again. It was not one crime, it was an arrangement of crimes, the kind that only looks clean from far away. As he typed, his expression remained still, but his eyes carried the faint glitter of ambition, stripped of conscience. When he saved the document, the small click of the mouse sounded almost obscene in the silence. Meanwhile, in the main office, Jack was still carrying the piece of the morning inside him. He had no idea that the trust he had just extended like a hand to a brother had, in reality, armed the person who would move against him first. That same day, the road would become the next stage of the betrayal. Jack left the office with the mind of a man already moving between tasks, messages, and unfinished obligations. He drove with his usual seriousness, the city passing in routine patterns outside his window. He was thinking not of danger, but of work, of responsibilities still waiting, of the next set of practical decisions that kept life moving. There was no reason, from his point of view, to expect what came next. That is often how betrayal works. It does not announce itself. It uses the ordinary moment because the ordinary moment is the least defended. The sound came first, a violent engine, too fast, too close, then impact. Metal screamed against metal with a force so sudden it seemed to tear the air open. Glass shattered. The steering wheel jerked. Jack's body was thrown hard against the seat, and restraints, pain exploding through him before thought could catch up. Blood came quickly, darker and warmer than he first understood, spreading across his shirt as his vision swam under the shock. For a few fractured seconds, time seemed to split into fragments: noise, pressure, brightness, then the sickening silence that follows disaster. He tried to breathe through the pain. He tried to understand. But even in those broken seconds, his mind reached for things that had nothing to do with the accident itself. The unfinished plans, the work waiting for him, the confidence with which he had handed authority to fuck that very morning, the trusting smile he had offered so freely. He did not know yet that the crash was not fate or misfortune, but design. He only knew that the world had tilted violently, and his body could no longer answer it the way it once had. Elsewhere, Tu Tien's day had opened in peace. Her vegetable garden was bright beneath the sunlight, green and carefully tended, the kind of place that reflected labor more than wealth. The leaves still held traces of moisture in their folds. The soil smelled clean and alive. She moved among the rows with patient hands, straightening one plant, checking another, her face softened by the quiet satisfaction that comes from nurturing something with steady devotion. Here, at least, life still obeyed effort. Plant, water, tend, wait. There was dignity in that rhythm. Then the footsteps came. Too many, too fast, too harsh for a garden. Before she could even fully rise, a group of people rushed in and shattered the morning with brutal efficiency. They did not come to argue, they came to destroy. Vegetables were uprooted and flung aside. Soil was torn up under careless feet. The pig pen was struck and kicked until parts of it gave way. The animals cried out in panic. Laughter hard, mocking, savage cut through the air in a way that made the destruction feel even more inhuman. Tu Tien stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend why her little world was being attacked so mercilessly. Then the shock became pain. She tried to protest, but the words died in her throat. She had poured effort into every row, every stake, every small corner of that life. What lay before her now was not just damage, it was violation. Her garden, which had held so much of her hope, was being torn apart like something worthless. Tears rose and spilled down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She did not know that this destruction had been arranged for a purpose, that it was meant to keep her occupied, overwhelmed, delayed. To Fook, it was merely another move on the board. To Tu Tien, it was the shattering of one more fragile shelter. And before she could even finish grieving that, a second blow came. The voices of villagers reached her in panic. Someone called her name. Someone shouted a question. Then the sentence arrived, and it landed like a blade driven straight through the center of her chest. Was she a relative of CEO Jack? There had been an accident. He was out on the road. She needed to come quickly. Everything inside her stopped. The ruined garden vanished from importance in an instant. The broken vegetables, the collapsed pen, the shock, the tears, they all became meaningless beside the image that now flooded her mind. Jack, injured, bleeding, alone. Her face went pale. Her whole body began to shake. The human heart can survive many small pains, but there are certain pieces of news that destroy thought itself. This was one of them. She could only cry, not elegantly, not with restraint. She cried with the helpless, terrified sound of someone whose entire inner world had just split open. There was no time to think, only time to move. She threw herself onto an old bicycle with hands still trembling so badly she could barely grip the handlebars. The road beneath the wheels was uneven, rough, unforgiving, but she pedaled with a desperation stronger than balance. Wind whipped against her face. Her tears blurred the way ahead. Her breath came in ragged bursts. People around her were already calling for an ambulance, their voices distant beneath the pounding of blood in her ears. She rode not with confidence, but with the raw strength fear gives to love when it has no other weapon left. By the time she reached him, the road had already become a gathering of horror and urgency. Jack was there, wounded, blood on his shirt, his body slumped in a way she had never seen before and never wanted to see again. She dropped from the bicycle and fell to her knees beside him. Her hand found his and clutched it as if the force of her grip alone might keep him from slipping away. Tears fell heavily onto the bloodstains. Her lips moved in broken prayers she barely heard herself say. Around them, voices rose, footsteps rushed, and finally, the ambulance arrived in a scream of sirens. She refused to let go, even when they lifted him, even when the doors closed, even when everything became white noise and movement and panic. She stayed with him because there was nothing else left to do that made sense. The hospital was cold in the way hospitals always are when life is being measured too closely. White walls, the smell of antiseptic, wheels passing quickly, doors opening and closing with practiced indifference. Somewhere, a machine was already beeping before she could even see him properly. Tu Tien sat beside Jack's bed with red, swollen eyes and hands wrapped so tightly around the edge of the mattress that her knuckles hurt. She was afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid that if she looked away for even 1 second, something irreversible might happen in that brief gap. Jack lay still under the hard white light. His face had lost its usual warmth. The strength she associated with him seemed unbearably fragile here. The doctor said very little. That silence became its own cruelty. It meant nothing was certain yet. It meant waiting. It meant that hope had not died, but neither had fear. The sound of the heart monitor filled the room with a terrible kind of rhythm, steady enough to comfort, repetitive enough to terrify. Every beep felt like a reminder that the line between life and loss can sometimes be measured only in seconds and sound. Tu Tien prayed without words. She prayed with posture, with tears, with the refusal to leave his side, with the way her body leaned toward him, as if she could absorb some of his pain by proximity alone. The future had narrowed to this room. There was no company now, no garden, no ruined vegetables. No title, no plan. Only a man on a hospital bed and a woman holding herself together by force because falling apart would help no one. Jack was alive. That was all she had. And yet, even that fragile fact was wrapped in uncertainty thick enough to suffocate them both. The story, by then, had already moved beyond a simple act of sabotage. it had become something darker and more painful. A betrayal inside the company, a staged collapse at the garden, a car wreck on the road, a woman forced to carry two shocks so close together that her heart barely had time to understand one before the next arrived. What made it so unbearable was not only the scale of the attack, but the intimacy of it. This was not random disaster. This was destruction aimed at the small, human places Jack and Tu Tien had been trying to protect. And maybe that is what gives this story its emotional weight. It begins in trust and ends in suspended terror. A promotion meant to ease responsibility becomes the opening move in a betrayal. A garden meant to nourish life is destroyed to create distraction. A road meant only to lead home becomes a place of blood and broken glass. And through it all, the one thing that remains unchanged is Tu Tien's refusal to leave the person she loves, even when everything else collapses at once. In the end, this is not only a story about conspiracy, violence, or ambition. It is about how easily trust can be weaponized when placed in the wrong hands, and how love is sometimes forced to prove itself not in gentle promises, but in hospital corridors, on shaking bicycle pedals, in blood-stained hands, and in the silent determination to stay when fear has already stripped away everything else. Jack may have handed power to the wrong man, but Tu Tien, without hesitation, handed Jack something far more valuable in return, the kind of loyalty that does not disappear when life turns cruel. And as the monitor kept beeping in that cold room, the only thing stronger than dread was the fragile, stubborn hope that perhaps love, once again, might still manage to survive what betrayal had tried to destroy.